On a cold November night in 1953, a government scientist walked into a New York hotel room. Less than a week earlier, he had discovered something that would change his life forever. People he trusted had secretly experimented on him. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't an enemy agent. He wasn't a criminal. He was a scientist who worked for the United States government, and now he was beginning to realize that the people around him had hidden the truth from him. Days later, he would fall from a hotel window and die. The official explanation was simple: suicide. But decades later, documents revealed a disturbing secret. Frank Olson had unknowingly been given LSD as part of a CIA program designed to explore the possibility of controlling and influencing the human mind. The program was called MKUltra, and Frank Olson's death would become one of the most controversial mysteries connected to it. But this story is not just about a mysterious death. It is about what happens when governments operate in complete secrecy, when ordinary people become part of experiments they never agreed to, and when the search for knowledge crosses a line that should never have been crossed. Because the most disturbing part of Frank Olson's story is not just what we know, it is what we still don't know. The year was 1953. The world was locked in the middle of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for military power, political influence, and intelligence superiority. But behind the weapons and political conflicts was another fear: the battle over the human mind. American officials were deeply concerned about reports that foreign governments were developing advanced interrogation methods and psychological techniques. What if an enemy could force someone to reveal secrets? What if a person's memories, emotions, or beliefs could be manipulated? What if the human mind itself could become a weapon? These fears led the CIA to begin exploring a highly secretive area of research. The goal was to understand whether drugs, psychological pressure, and other techniques could influence human behavior. This research would eventually become known as MKUltra. Officially, it was an attempt to study human psychology and discover how the mind worked. But behind closed doors, some experiments crossed ethical boundaries that would shock the public when they were eventually revealed. Some people volunteered. Others had no idea they were being studied at all. And one of those people was Frank Olson. Frank Olson was not the kind of person most people would expect to become connected to one of the CIA's darkest secrets. Born in 1910, Olson eventually became a researcher working for the United States Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland. At the time, Fort Detrick was one of America's main centers for biological warfare research. The work being done there was highly classified. Scientists were studying biological agents and exploring ways they could potentially be used or defended against during a period when governments feared a new kind of warfare. Olson was trusted. He was intelligent, dedicated, and considered reliable enough to work in an environment where information was carefully controlled. But outside of his classified work, Olson lived a much more ordinary life. He was a husband, a father, a person with a family who expected him to come home every day. To the government, he was a scientist working on secret projects. But that life was about to change forever, because within months, Frank Olson would become connected to a secret experiment he never agreed to take part in. In November of 1953, Frank Olson attended a gathering with other scientists and government employees. On the surface, it seemed like a normal event. People who worked in highly classified environments often met together to discuss research, exchange ideas, and build relationships with colleagues. But this meeting was different, because hidden from some of the people in the room was an experiment. The CIA was interested in LSD. At the time, the drug was still relatively unknown. Officials wanted to understand how it affected the human mind. Could it influence behavior? Could it change a person's emotions? Could it reveal new ways to manipulate or control human responses? These were the questions behind the research. But the way the experiment was conducted created one of the biggest controversies in the history of MKUltra. Some people at the gathering were secretly given LSD without their knowledge. They had not agreed to participate in a psychological experiment, and they did not know they had taken a substance that could dramatically alter their perception and emotional state. Frank Olson was one of them. Without his knowledge, he had become part of a CIA experiment. At first, Olson reportedly did not fully understand what had happened. But when he discovered that he had been given LSD without his permission, the situation became even more disturbing. The effects of the drug were only one part of the problem. The bigger issue was the realization that people he trusted, colleagues and government officials he worked alongside, had secretly used him as a test subject. For someone whose career depended on trust and secrecy, this revelation was devastating. According to later accounts from his family and investigators, Olson began to change. The confident scientist who had once been focused and dependable appeared increasingly troubled. He questioned his work. He worried about his future. And those close to him noticed that something was wrong. A man who had spent years being trusted with government secrets was now struggling with the knowledge that his own government had hidden something from him. The CIA later acknowledged that Olson had been given LSD without his knowledge, and that the experiment had been mishandled. But by the time the truth came out publicly, it was too late. Frank Olson's life had already taken a tragic turn. As Olson's mental state continued to decline, the people around him searched for a way to help. According to later accounts, his family believed he needed professional support. The CIA became involved and arranged for Olson to travel to New York City, where he would meet with a doctor. But this is where the story becomes more complicated, because the people responsible for the secret experiment were now involved in managing its aftermath. In late November 1953, Olson arrived in New York. He checked into the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. He was accompanied by CIA employee Harold Abramson, who was involved in the events surrounding Olson's treatment. The official explanation was that Olson was there to receive psychiatric help. But only days after secretly being given LSD, Frank Olson would be dead, and the events that followed would leave his family searching for answers for decades. In the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson fell from the window of his hotel room. He died shortly afterward. The initial conclusion was suicide. At the time, the public knew nothing about MKUltra. They did not know Olson had secretly received LSD. They did not know the CIA had been experimenting with methods of influencing human behavior, and they did not know that the organization connected to the experiment was also connected to the final days of Olson's life. To his family, it appeared that they had lost a husband and father during a personal crisis, but they were missing a crucial part of the story. The truth about what had happened to Frank Olson remained hidden. For years, the official explanation went unchallenged, until a series of investigations in the 1970s began uncovering one of the most disturbing government secrets in American history. The public was shocked as government programs that had operated in secrecy were brought into the light. Among the revelations was the existence of MKUltra. The CIA acknowledged that it had conducted research involving LSD and other methods of influencing human behavior. For the first time, Olson's family learned what had happened before his death. The government admitted that he had been given LSD without his knowledge. Officials acknowledged that proper consent had not been obtained. They admitted that mistakes had been made. But for Olson's family, those admissions created a new problem. They answered one question, but they created another. What really happened in that hotel room? In 1975, President Gerald Ford met with members of the Olson family. The government later provided compensation to them, but money and apologies could not replace the answers the family wanted. They wanted to know why Frank Olson had been selected for the experiment. They wanted to know exactly what happened during his final days. And most importantly, they wanted to know whether his death was truly what the government claimed it was. One of the biggest questions was whether Olson actually took his own life. Some researchers have argued that the possibility of foul play should not be ignored. They believe Olson may have known information that made him a problem for people connected to the program. The reason the case remains controversial is because even the confirmed facts are deeply disturbing. But Frank Olson's story was only one part of something much larger. The CIA conducted hundreds of experiments connected to MKUltra. Researchers explored drugs, hypnosis, sensory experiments, and psychological manipulation. Then, in 1973, many MKUltra documents were destroyed under orders from CIA leadership. Because of that destruction, historians still do not know the full scope of everything that happened. Some experiments may never be completely understood. Some victims may never even be identified. And that uncertainty is part of what makes MKUltra so disturbing, because the missing information leaves behind a question. How much do we still not know? Is this still happening today behind closed doors? And what happens when the pursuit of knowledge becomes more important than the people involved?